Hello. Welcome to an actual build log, because I do those now. So I am a cosplayer and an avid gamer, which means why stop at one ludicrously expensive hobby when you can have two, or more, depending on who you are, and what kind of life choices you make, and how much you hate yourself. Anyway, so one of my favourite game franchises is actually The Legend of Zelda. I remember being a kid and opening up the Nintendo 64 on Christmas morning with my older brother, and we played The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time until we had to stop for, normal people things like eating and sleeping and going to school. But that was my favourite game back then, and it's still kind of my favourite game now to this day. I've actually combined my hobby and cosplayed from Zelda a couple of times, as seen here. I've cosplayed Malon, the adult version from the Adult Link timeline in the Ocarina of Time game, and I've cosplayed Twilight Princess Zelda, technically we're talking Ganon's puppet Zelda, from the Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess game. That's a costume that I'd really love to revisit one day. And at the time of editing this video, it actually occurred to me that I had completely forgotten a third costume that I had made from the Legend of Zelda franchise, which was the horse god Melania from the Breath of the Wild and the Tears of the Kingdom games on the Nintendo Switch. Back to the intro. I actually really wanted to cosplay from Zelda again, but I wanted to make a costume that wasn't too difficult or too taxing on me, and I wanted to fill a couple of requirements as well. I wanted the costume to be comfortable to wear, especially if I was going to a convention all day or if I was judging or needed to run around on the floor. And if possible, I wanted to use some fabric from my ginormous fabric stash behind me and just really make it a stash buster costume. And took two new games in the Legend of Zelda franchise that I absolutely fell in love with: Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. Now, there were plenty of characters that I loved in both of these games, but there was one particular character that really caught my eye. That's right, we're not talking Hylian, Goron, Ruto, Zora, Gerudo, Zonai, none of those races. We're talking Koroks. Look, I thought those guys were really cute in the Wind Waker game, but in these two games, that was a whole other level they brought in. And I just thought they were so stinking cute that I wanted to cosplay one. So I will! Alright, this costume is going to be a challenge for me in two ways. Firstly, I want to make a costume inspired by a series I love, but as much of an original design that it has to be recognisable. And secondly, this costume has to be sustainable. That means that I'm giving myself a challenge to make this costume entirely out of things that I have in my stash. And anything that I do buy has to be secondhand, which means that this entire costume is going to be one giant stash buster. Alright, with those two easy parameters out of the way, let's see how we go. Just as a forewarning to this crafting video, there are some spots that will have a lot of footage missing. That is because I was moving house in the process of making this video, and I have unfortunately lost a lot of that footage. So apologies in advance if you see any gaps in the process of making things. I just can't find the video for them, or the video that I have is corrupted. So just let's use our imaginations. Here's my preliminary sketch of the Korok look. I based a lot of these design choices on what I think would look good, as well as what I had lying around in my stash to make it as much of a stash buster costume as possible. I've included a lot of different elements from multiple Zelda games that I thought were quite cute and worked well together. Let's start from the beginning in breaking this design down. Firstly, if we're going for an original style humanized Korok, I would like to base her race off a Hylian, using prosthetic ears to elongate them and keep them tied to the Zelda universe. I've matched her skin tone to mine in the design because I'm pretty olive toned, but I've also added freckles just because I think freckles are a really sweet look. For the hair and eyes, I want to keep the colour palette consistent all the way through, so I'll be using green contact lenses and a brown wig that was very kindly donated to me by a friend. To make the design recognisably a Korok, I wanted to add a leaf mask that I could wear on the side of my head, maybe mounted on a headband or a cute bandana. The Korok mask is based off Makar, which is the Korok Sage of Wind from the Wind Waker game, which is, incidentally, the first Zelda game in the Zelda universe to feature Koroks altogether. This design is also featured as the Korok mask that you can get in the Breath of the Wild DLC Master Trials, as well as the Tears of the Kingdom in the Depths when you defeat the Black Hinox in the Colosseum. For the shirt, I wanted to incorporate a nice big billowy bishop sleeve and have some cute cuffs attached, as well as maybe incorporate some sort of collar with some leather for lacing. I want to draw some inspiration from Robin Hood, and if I have enough fabric, maybe I'll also add a yoke, who knows. For the belt, there's not really much to say. I just happen to have a big thick belt I bought ages ago that frankly I don't remember what I got it for in the first place, and it's in brown, so I'll add that in to cinch the waist a bit. For the lower half of the design, I thought a gathered skirt with shoulder straps combo would look quite sweet, and maybe add a ruffle on the bottom. I'd make it brown like the wooden bodies of the Koroks, and maybe add some lighter wood grain to it for contrast. I want to make the socks dark green just to add a bit more variety to the colour palette, and also because I have some dark green knit scrap fabric that needs using. I thought some brown ankle boots would look good with the socks, and maybe with an accessory on the side, maybe some leaves, some berries would give it a nice splash of colour. And lastly, if I have time, I also want to make a pinwheel, because it's whimsical, and I like whimsical things. And here's the final look all brought together. Once the colours are assembled, it really does all come together and start looking like something, doesn't it? I really like how it turned out. Alrighty, let's get started on the build then. The first thing I want to get started on is the shirt, and I had some light olive green linen that I decided to use for the shirt from my stash. Being a natural fibre, linen is both comfortable and breathable, and I did like the colour, so let's go with this one. I used a Butterick B5008 men's history shirt as a base, and modifying it to make it my own style with the front and back yoke, as well as really wide bishop sleeves. This poet style shirt would also have front lacing as well as a bit of a collar on it. After pre-washing the fabric, I began cutting it to put the shirt together, but I realised only most of the way through cutting that I'd actually run short of fabric, so the shirt itself is actually going to be a little bit shorter than expected. You won't see this while it's being worn, but because my bust size is quite large by comparison to regular sizes, it did lift a lot of the fabric upwards, so I had to make sure it would be at least long enough to fit under the belt. One of the saving graces about this fabric is that it actually ironed pretty nicely. I was feeling a bit too lazy to get out the overlocker and thread it in green, so a lot of these hems are double folds and neat. After the collar was put together on the shirt, I hammered in the eyelets at the front for lacing. I had a few different colours of leather cord in my stash, but ultimately I decided on this nice light brown chocolatey colour. I also went digging in my bead box and found some wooden beads to tie on the ends of the cords to stop them from pulling through the eyelets. This won't be the last time I dig some fun stuff out of my stash for this project. Now originally I'd planned to make the cuffs on the sleeves have buttons in the original design sketch, but this is supposed to be an easy costume, right? And technically because it's my own design, I make all the rules. So we're going to go with snap closures. I found some in my trusty stash from a previous project that matched the colour scheme and hammered them in place, 2 closures on each sleeve cuff. Now I can open and close the cuffs easily without having to fiddle with buttonholes. They're not historically accurate, but we're definitely not trying to be historically accurate here. We're just having some fun with the design. And with that, the poet shirt is done for Korok. You can tell from the way that it sits on my mannequin that it's not quite as long as I'd like it to be. This is one of the difficulties of working with items from your stash. You have limited quantities to play with, and most of the times you can't find it again in stores, especially if you've bought it ages ago. To mitigate this, I could have probably reduced some of the fabric amounts in the bishop sleeves, but truthfully, I quite like the fullness of them as they are. It's also a bit hard to see, but I quite like how neatly I finished the collar too. Moving into the skirt now, and I've had this polar fleece in my stash for 8 years. That's way too long. So we're going to use it for the skirt and some shoulder straps. Since I'll be wearing a petticoat under it for a fluffy silhouette, let's go for something super quick and easy and just cut a long rectangle, which we can then gather into a waistband later. I have to say, polar fleece really puts up some resistance to cutting. I had to get out my heavy duty shears to cut this. After overlocking the edges, I attached the ruffle. The ruffle at the bottom was pretty easy to sew. I just made a folded stripe of fabric, gathered it and sewed it to the bottom edge. And then came the fun part, making the bark details on the fabric. For the texture, I took some inspiration from Hestu, our favourite maraca slinging mover and shaker, whose body is, I think, based off a paper birch tree bark. Regardless, the main body colour is brown with white stripes, so I mixed up some fabric medium with white acrylic paint and got to painting. The great thing about the skirt is that the tree bark texture is supposed to be organic, so I can get a bit messy with it and not have to stress too much about the outcome. So in the future, you can use that excuse too if your costume's a bit messy. Just say it's organic. I made the shoulder straps by sewing them into straight rectangles and lined them with just some thick cotton I had lying around, crossing them over at the back. I then gathered the skirt into a waistband and then attached the shoulder straps. The skirt closes at a side seam using some simple hooks and bars. And this is what the skirt looks like all together. I made sure that the waistband sat high enough that you could tuck the shirt into it without any trouble. I actually had a small hoop skirt from another project that I made that I wore under it to give it a voluminous shape. But when I've been wearing this costume, I've also just worn a simple petticoat instead under it for a slightly less rounded silhouette. I really like the contrast of colours and how they're a little muted as well. I'm pretty pleased with the result, I'd say. For the socks, I just cut some of my green jersey fabric into tubes and sewed it together using the overlocker. Since they don't really have a foot part, I guess they're better branded as leg warmers instead. Now, could I have just bought some green socks and be done with it? I suppose so, but that stash of fabric is there to be used. And that's all the fabric components of the costume done. I'm pretty happy with how this is looking so far, but we still have a long way to go before it's finished. These cute ankle boots secondhand, and I decided not to alter them in any way because I just think they're pretty neat as they are and I could use them for another costume in the future. But I did want to personalise them a bit, so I'm making a removable clip of berries and leaves. This is another callback to Wind Waker with the berry stems that Hollow holds, which are also in both Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom as Koroks. I went shuffling through my stash and found some large red wooden beads, as well as some smaller red plastic ones for the berries. Then I went digging in my fake flowers bin and found some nice large leaves for the base. I used some hot glue to jam the bottom of the leaf into the wooden bead and hold it into place, and I hand stitched the smaller beads above it in a scattered pattern. And lastly, a fascinator clip was hot glued into the back. These fascinator clips are really great for temporary details like attaching these leaves onto the boots, because you can just clip them on and the teeth and the clip are pretty secure. To attach the leaf and berry clip to the shoe, all I have to do is open up the fascinator clip and slip it on over the edge of the boot, and it stays in place quite nicely. If I want to reuse the boots for another costume, I can just unclip them like so. I will note, while the fascinator clips work great on something small and light like these berry leaves, they probably won't do much good on anything heavier. And here's what the boots look like, assembled with the berry leaf clip and the socks. I folded down the top ends of the socks for a cleaner look, although if I have to really be honest, they kind of ended up looking like golfing socks. Well, I think they're cute anyway. I began working on the mask by sketching out a design of the mask onto paper first. I didn't want to make it too big and oversized, but I still wanted it to be recognisable as a major component, so I went through a couple of iterations before settling on a size that I liked. After cutting the mask out, I traced it onto 10mm EVA foam and used a craft knife to cut out the basic pattern of it first before refining the shape. Once the mask was cut, I used my Dremel to round off the edges. I wanted to refine the shapes more, so I drew the centre line in the mask and then a few more lines going outwards to look more like a leaf, which I then sanded into using my Dremel for more depth. The lines came out looking not very straight, I admit. They're organic. I cut out the mouth and eye holes, but if I had to be honest, I just couldn't get past my absolutely botched Dremel lines, and in the end, well, I decided I hated it too much, so I decided to just cut out a new mask without any of the sanding lines in it. I think this flat one looks simpler but a lot better, and you can see another mask in the background of this shot for my nephew, who was also requesting a Korok mask for himself. When I painted this mask, I wanted to have some cell shading, so I decided to redraw the shapes into a kind of gradient map style, showing me which areas to colour lighter. I wanted to colour the mask in layers, so to do this I made simple templates by just making multiple copies of the design. Next I used the template to draw holes for the eyes and the mouth and cut them out. Once the mask holes were cut, it was just a matter of painting it. I started from darkest green to the lightest and I did a few coats of each colour by hand using simple acrylic paints. I added a layer of black interfacing on the back of the mask to black out the eyes and mouth holes, but it's fine enough for me to look through if I ever decide to wear it like a regular mask. And for the headband, I just ended up cutting a strip of green felt to tie around my chin and then gluing the mask on there with hot glue. Pretty simple. And this is how the mask looks when it's worn on a mannequin head. I think it came out really cute, and it's very recognisable too. Just an apologies for the section in advance, a lot of the making of footage has unfortunately been lost. The Pinwheel is one of the many clues you'll find at a Korok spot that activates a puzzle, and I thought it would be a fun prop to hold. I was lucky enough to find a cheap oversized pinwheel at an op shop, or what you'd call a thrift or second-hand store. The pattern took a little bit of finagling, but I managed to make a decent looking pattern shape in the end. I cut the blades of the pinwheel out of a thick coloured cardstock and added the little veiny bits that look like leaf veins over the top using paint pens. I assembled the centre parts using eyelets, which I glued the fans of the pinwheel to in the centre on the front and the back. The base stick of the pinwheel was easy enough to pull apart since I only needed to replace the blades. Assembling the pinwheel together is simpler than it looks. You just pop off the nubbin at the front and slide the pinwheel in, and you can use the plastic tube parts that came with it originally to keep the blades separated from the base. I will admit that it looks way more difficult when I try to film it, but I think that's just me being awkward. And there you have it, a handheld oversized pinwheel prop that only took a couple of hours to make at most. The best thing about this pinwheel is that it's wind activated, so if you're standing somewhere breezy it'll spin on its own, but it also spins when you just hold it normally and walk somewhere. Wanted something to keep my phone, wallet and convention necessities in, and wouldn't you know it, I found this round wicker pouch that would be perfect to modify. I decided to make one of the Korok puzzle platforms to put on the bag, which is a cut-off tree stump and an arrow emblem in the shape of a leaf. Since the bag looks like a basket rather than a tree stump, I need to make a cover for it, so let's bust out the trusty EVA foam. Firstly, I need to cut a circle for the stump just a little smaller than the bag. I used a bowl to trace the circle, but you can raid any part of your house for a suitable item. I then took my craft knife and cut the circle out of foam. I didn't need to be too careful with this step, and I'll show you why. Once the circle was cut out, I went back around the edges with my craft knife and made an absolute dog's breakfast out of the edges to make it look like bark. I also cut into the top part a little bit to make it look like cracking wood. Please note, do not use my horrendous cutting technique for your own projects. Cut away from you at all times. I don't know what I was doing here practicing this absolutely awful cutting technique. I'm lucky I didn't slice my finger off. What the heck? Now to make the surface look like wood grain, and for that I got my craft knife again and scored shallow cuts over the top in circles. Once again, we're going for the magic word organic, so it's okay if my cuts are a little bit wobbly and uneven. Once I finished the cuts, I went over the scores in the foam with a heat gun. This is to shrink the foam a bit and open up the cuts a little bit wider so you can really see the detail. Time to prime the foam before painting. Heat sealing with the heat gun did help, but you really should be priming foam properly before painting it. I found an old bottle of Flex Bond kicking around that will do the trick. The foam won't really be flexing since it'll be mounted onto the front of a bag, but it will do nicely to seal the foam. I slapped some Flex Bond liberally on the edges of the stump, but I was a little bit more careful priming the top, making the effort to keep my brush strokes in a round motion to follow the wood grain. After the primer had dried, it was time to paint, and because this is a stash buster project through and through, I busted out some old acrylic paints I had lying around to do the job. I did a base coat over the entire stump with a dark brown acrylic paint, and then went over the top surface with a light tan colour. Because my acrylic paint was pretty thin, I had to do multiple coats of each colour, but I didn't mind since the weather was quite warm and the layers dried pretty fast. I painted in an orange gradient for the centre, but by now I was realising that the coats of paint were building up and were obscuring the lines of the wood grain a little more than I actually liked. So to remedy this and to bring back the wood grain detail, I took a thin paintbrush and went over the lines with some light brown paint to really make them pop. Before I painted the leaf arrow in the middle, I decided that the tree stump was looking a little bit too clean. It really could do with some mossy edges. I found a few different green paints and sort of mushed them together on my palette before taking a small sponge and sponging bits here and there on the edge of the stump, just to give it a little bit of extra detail. Painting the leaf arrow detail on the stump centre was relatively easy. I just copied the reference image as best as I could onto the middle of the stump and then added more detail using varying shades of oranges and browns. Before I started putting the bag together, I had to decide on a way to carry it. I didn't feel like slinging it over my shoulder like a regular bag, but I had the idea of clipping it onto my belt. I found these lobster clasps in my stash, and I decided to cut the bag straps short enough to attach them to the belt with the clasps like a pouch. So, once I carefully measured where I wanted the bag to hang, I took my scissors and cut the leather straps apart. Then I looped the end of the lobster clasp into the end of the strap, and I used my waxed strong thread to hand stitch the leather into place. It was pretty tough going, and for the life of me I could not find my awl to make new holes in the leather, so I just ended up using the existing stitching holes to pass my needle through so I wouldn't snap it. Bit by bit, I worked my way around the ends of the leather straps until I had sealed the ends shut and enclosed the metal loop of the lobster clasp inside. And there we have it, a nice sturdy clasp on the end of our bag strap. Now it was time to assemble the pieces. Once the bag straps were altered, I used some contact adhesive to glue the tree stump insignia to the surface of the bag. I did this by taking a silicone brush and spreading an even, thin layer of contact adhesive onto the back of the foam tree stump. After that, I added a thin layer of contact adhesive to the front of the bag. I didn't have to be too precious about making sure it was perfect because the bag wouldn't see much wear and movement anyway. Once the glue had enough time to air dry and become tacky, I mushed the two pieces together to form a permanent bond. I made a notch in the back of the stump to mark which way was up. One thing I had to do is to make sure the leaf was pointing upwards when I glued everything together. And here's how my tree stump Korok puzzle bag came out. Well, it's more of a belt pouch if we want to be specific, but I really loved the texture of the woven bag and the detail of the wood grain on the stump. I was tempted to really up the mossy factor by buying some fake moss to enhance the paint job and the edges of the stump, getting it all up in those nooks and crannies, but ultimately I wanted this to be a stash-only costume, so I reined myself in and I left it at that. I thought one bag would be enough, but while I was out and about, I happened to find an almost identical bag in another op shop. And I had to buy it. The different shapes make it look so eclectic, but in a good way, and as you can see, I've already shortened the straps and gotten them ready to hang on my belt. Now, how was I going to decorate this one? In keeping with the theme, I knew I had to incorporate another Korok puzzle into it, and then I remembered the flower following puzzle. If you're a fan of Korok hunting, you'll remember this puzzle. You follow each of the yellow flowers in a path until you find the last white one, and then a Korok will appear and gift you with a Korok seed. In the end, I decided to make a little cluster of flowers on the front of the bag. First, I drew out a flower petal pattern on paper and cut it out, just freestyling it since it was pretty simple. Then I found some 2mm craft foam in my stash in the appropriate yellow and white colours. I traced around the petal template and cut each petal out, 5 for each flower, 5 flowers in total, which means 25 petals cut out. I used some simple acrylic paint to add a gradient to the middle of each of the petals. orange for the yellow petals, and a blue for the white victory flower petals. Once all the flower petals were dried, I attached them to the bag in a spray formation with just some dabs of hot glue. But the flowers looked a little bit silly just by themselves, so once again I raided my stash of fake fabric flowers and bulked up the look a little bit with a couple of fabric leaves. And here's the final look of the flower puzzle bag. I think I have mixed feelings about this one. I guess it does capture the spirit of the puzzle enough with the coloured flowers, leaves, and that white one flower you catch at the end that rewards you with the Korok seed, but I think in the end I still like the first one better. Maybe I think the stump detail came out nicer. Now the belt is just a slightly sad plasticky belt that I had in the stash that needed using. I hand sewed some loops to the bottom edge of the belt using some strong thread, and the bags just hang off the loops by the lobster clasps. Easy. The Acorn Pots are probably one of my favourite puzzles in Zelda because they're just so easy and fun to shoot. The puzzle itself is simple enough. You encounter an acorn pot or jar or whatever it is hanging around in the wild, usually it's inside a tree stump, and to claim the Korok seed all you have to do is hit it with an arrow. I thought maybe I'll just make a couple of them to hang off the belt, just because they should be fairly straightforward to do, but also because I'm just really fond of the design. Started with some foam clay I had kicking around, and after smushing it around to loosen it up, I rolled it into some vague acorn-esque shapes. There's no rhyme or reason to this step. Like most of this outfit, I'm just oscillating wildly between vibes and panic. Once again, it doesn't matter if they're a bit wonky because we're going for organic. After the body of the acorn pot was done, it was time to put it aside to dry and make the little acorn lid, cover. Let's call it a hat, that's much cuter. I took 2 scraps of foam and glued them together, carved out the basic shape and smoothed the sides. Then I covered the acorn hat with a layer of warbler to make it nice and solid. I did this by cutting out a square of warbler slightly larger than the foam piece, heating it with my heat gun slowly and gently pulling it down over the edges to smooth out the sides. Warbler can get pretty hot and difficult to handle if you warm it up too much, so I found that using a silicone spatula really helped with the process. I ended up alternating between using my hands and the silicone spatula to gently pull down and smooth the sides of the warbler, trimming away the excess as I went to make it easier to handle. Once the little acorn hat was covered, I used a simple pair of scissors to trim away the excess warbler at the bottom. I made sure to leave a tiny excess of warbler that I could push underneath the bottom surface of the hat so that it would be completely smooth edge. It might look a little bit messy underneath, but nobody's going to see this anyway. I also included a little warbler loop on the top to give the acorn jar something to hang off when it's attached to the belt. This was just easily done by rolling out a little scrap of warbler into a wormy-dealy kind of shape, turning it into a loop and just sticking it on the top. The body and the top of the acorn pot were primed with a couple of coats of Flex Bond, so the paint will adhere to the foam clay in more even coats. I know the warbler gave the top of the acorn a bit of a rough texture, but I don't really mind. It's actually quite a nice contrast to the smooth body of the acorn. Once completely dry, I painted the little acorn hat a stark white colour with acrylic paint and then gave it a coat of sealant. Now it's time to paint the body of the acorn, and the difficult part for me will be to get the pattern right. According to the reference images, the acorn is a dark brown colour with a cream coloured swirl design on the front. Originally I wanted to paint the body dark brown and add the light coloured swirl over the top, but I find that it's way easier to paint dark over light than light over dark, way less coats and cleaner lines. So the body of the acorn was painted cream first, and I very painstakingly carefully added the brown in a pattern over the top. After getting the initial lines of the swirl detail in, I painted the rest of the dark brown colour, waiting until each coat dried before building up the colour and evenness with more coats of acrylic paint. And this is what the acorn looks like after it's painted. I think it's pretty close to the design. Once everything on the acorn was painted, dried and sealed, it was time to start assembling them all together. I began by digging through my fake flowers box, which, let's be real, has been the MVP of this build, and finding some suitably dark leaves. Then I snipped them apart. Strangely enough, these ones were attached to one another, so I actually had to cut them into individual parts first. Because this acorn pot is such a tiny, lightweight piece, hot glue is going to come in handy here. After all, it's not a competition costume or anything like that, and personally I think hot glue does have its place in costuming, just not holding hems together. I trimmed away parts of the leaves that would be hidden underneath the little acorn hat to reduce bulk, and began gluing them down, spacing them evenly. I did have to make sure that the leaves wouldn't hide the swirl pattern while I did this. They still stuck up quite stiffly, so to make them lie flat against the body of the acorn, I also added a dab of glue at the top to stick the leaf down. Once the leaves were all in place and glued down to the acorn body, it was just a matter of plopping some more hot glue to the top and smushing the acorn's little hat on to cover all the sins. And there you go, a completed, very cute little acorn pot. I'm not going to lie, I just wanted a whole bunch of gold, shiny knickknacks. Now look, the whole reason for hunting the Koroks is to get rewarded with these little gold Korok Seeds, which then you take to Hestu and he expands your inventory. And I wanted to make some Korok Seeds to not only have in my bag as a prop, but to also give out as cute handmade trinkets when I see people at conventions. So I busted out some grey foam clay and got to making the seeds, and I made a lot. A lot. It was kind of therapeutic, actually. Once I sculpted an unreasonable amount of Korok Seeds by hand, I needed to prime and paint all of them. To do so in the easiest way, I used a bamboo kebab stick to poke it into the undersides, and that way I could prime and paint them more easily by stacking them onto my drying rack. Because there were so many Korok Seeds, I ended up having to prime and paint all of them in batches because there wasn't nearly enough room on my drying rack for all of them, and also I think I ran out of bamboo kebab sticks at one point. After priming, I used a can of gold spray paint with a metallic finish and a little glitter, which I think turned out quite nicely. It ended up having lots of gold little sparkly bits in it. And after a couple of coats, I think they came out very pretty. Once all the Korok Seeds were finished, I just shoved them into one of my bags, ready to hand out to friends and other Zelda fans at conventions. And before anyone says anything, I am completely aware that having the Korok Seeds stuck to the end of a kebab stick gave them little bumholes. I am completely aware, and I think it gives them character. Thank you very much. And that's the end of the build. Korok was such a fun costume to design from a concept and turn into a reality. It's a really comfortable costume to wear and it's very recognisable, and I have a lot of fun at conventions with it. And I'm also really happy that now I have another costume in my collection from the Zelda series. There were a few upsets here and there and things that just didn't turn out the way that I wanted them to, but there were some things that turned out way better than I thought they would. So I think it's a win-win. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed watching the process of making a costume from the very beginning, or even if you just wanted to have a video on in the background while you do your own crafting, please consider subscribing to my channel. I will endeavour to make more building vlogs for future projects, and I'd love to take you guys along on the ride with me. As always, stay crafty and I'll see you in the next video. And now, let's look at the final result.